The IS-4 weighed close to 60 tons and carried more armor than any other tank the Soviet Union ever built. It could take hits from the heaviest German shells without flinching. And yet not a single IS-4 ever fired its gun at a real enemy. Most of them ended up buried in frozen dirt along the Chinese border, where they slowly rusted into the ground. The whole program ate up enormous resources, years of engineering work, and caused endless headaches for everyone involved, from factory workers to government ministers. What follows is the full story of how this machine came to be, why it failed, and what eventually happened to it. Back in the summer of 1943, the engineers at the Chelyabinsk-Kirov plant, the sprawling factory complex people called Tankograd, were already worried. The IS-2 heavy tank was still months away from reaching frontline units, and they could see it wouldn't stay relevant for long. German anti-tank weapons were getting more powerful with every passing season. Newer German tanks and assault guns carried longer-barreled cannons, with significantly higher muzzle velocities. Rather than wait for the military brass to ask, the Chelyabinsk team started working on something heavier on their own. In November of that year, the Red Army's main armored directorate put out an official set of requirements for a next-generation heavy tank. The specs called for a vehicle weighing no more than 55 tons, with armor between 160 and 200 millimeters thick, an engine in the 800 to 1,000 horsepower range, a main gun of either 122 or 152 millimeters, and a crew of 5. No tank anywhere in the world came close to meeting those numbers at the time. On December 10, 1943, the Chelyabinsk engineers brought their proposal to Vyacheslav Malyshev, the people's commissar of the tank industry. They called it Project K. Malyshev liked what he saw and approved government funding to keep the work going. The design featured a stretched hull with heavier armor plating and a turret that was entirely new, not based on anything already in production. By January 1944, the project had gone through enough changes to earn a new internal designation, Object 701. The hull kept more or less the same layout, but the turret was reworked extensively. Engineers reshaped the front plate and gun mantelet, thickened the roof, and got rid of the rear-facing machine gun port. For armament, they chose a 122 mm S-34 gun. The engine was a V12 rated at 750 horsepower, fitted with a centrifugal supercharger adapted from the AM-38 aircraft engine. Stalin personally signed off on building Object 701 prototypes on April 8, 1944. The very first one, designated Prototype Number 0, came off the assembly line 2 days later, and before April was out, it was ready for trials. That kind of speed was remarkable even for wartime, when factories routinely ran around the clock, and sleep was something engineers caught on cots next to the machines they were building. 2 additional prototypes, numbered 1 and 2, got the green light shortly after and were completed between May and June. Prototype number 1 had a simplified design meant to be easier to mass produce. Certain fittings like turret handrails were left off, and it mounted an S-34D2 gun along with a 50 mm S-11 mortar in the turret. Prototype number 2 carried a 100 mm S-34 gun, part of an effort to figure out which weapon worked best in the turret. Both finished their driving tests by late July and were then taken apart so engineers could examine every component up close. The teardown turned up transmission problems and issues with the B-12 engine. Neither was surprising. Prototypes almost always have drivetrain trouble, and the overall picture was positive enough to keep going. A 4th prototype, stripped of some equipment, was built just for ballistic testing. In August, it went to the Kubinka Proving Ground, where testers shot at it with Soviet guns and captured German ones. The armor held up much better than the IS-2's, which was encouraging. But the tests also showed that German 75 mm and 88 mm guns could still punch through in certain spots, particularly around the turret. Clearly, more steel was needed where it mattered most. On August 11th, Malyshev ordered the Chelyabinsk plant to revise the armor layout based on the shooting trials and have a reworked prototype ready before October. The redesign started right away. Engineers increased the front hull plates from 120 to 140 millimeters and brought the turret up to 200 millimeters of cast armor. At the same time, the factory was also rebuilding the first and second prototypes with updated parts. Once the work was done, the first became prototype number 5, and the second became prototype number 6. A numbering system that made sense internally, but confused almost everyone else. Each new iteration incorporated whatever the previous round of tests had revealed. The reworked fourth prototype was finished in November 1944, and all 3 vehicles, 4th, 5th, and 6th, went through driving trials in the second half of the month. Once those tests were complete, the 5th and 6th prototypes were armed with 122mm guns. The 5th got the S-34, while the 6th received the D-25T, the same gun already in use on production IS-2 tanks, where it had earned a solid reputation. Both vehicles went back to Kubinka for live-fire trials. There were some supercharger problems along the way. One incident knocked out an engine entirely. But on the whole, the testing commission was impressed. The head of the commission specifically noted the strong armor protection, effective firepower, decent mobility, and, somewhat surprisingly for a prototype, reasonable mechanical reliability. The Commission recommended that Object 701 be adopted by the Red Army. Malyshev, however, disagreed. He had his own calculations, and they pointed in a different direction. He maintained that the testing had been insufficient and that shifting the Chelyabinsk plant to yet another tank type would reduce total armored vehicle production across the board. In his view, the factory simply did not have the capacity to build Object 701 alongside the IS-2 and the IS-U series of heavy self-propelled guns. He also favored the IS-3, another heavy tank being developed at the same plant, which he considered simpler to manufacture and nearly as well protected. The Chelyabinsk plant's leadership and its engineers saw things differently. They argued that Object 701 was superior to the IS-3 in several practical respects. The crew had more room to work, and the vehicle was easier to service and repair in the field. What followed was an ugly bureaucratic fight, with the factory and the military on one side and the commissariat on the other. Letters flew back and forth, meetings ended in shouting matches, and each side accused the other of putting the country's defense at risk. It escalated to the point where senior government officials had to step in. A compromise was hammered out in March 1945. Object 701 would go through another, more demanding round of trials, and the Chelyabinsk plant could meanwhile begin tooling up for production. Nothing was guaranteed, but at least the project hadn't been killed. The 6th prototype started its new testing cycle in April and ran for several weeks. When the Commission filed its report, it acknowledged some lingering concerns, but concluded that the mechanical systems were good enough for service use. By late July, the tank was again submitted for formal adoption. Malyshev continued to resist. He pointed out that heavy tank production was already falling short of targets and warned that introducing another model would make the situation worse. By this point, the war in Europe had ended. Defense factories were scaling back. Workers were leaving, and there was less political urgency behind new weapons programs. The Object 701 program drifted through the rest of 1945 without a clear resolution. Not officially canceled, not officially approved. The IS-3 was absorbing all of the Chelyabinsk plant's production bandwidth, and plenty of officials in Moscow considered Object 701 unnecessary as long as the IS-3 was rolling off the line. That thinking started to change in early 1946. Reports from military units were painting an ugly picture of the IS-3. The tank Malyshev had pushed so hard was turning out to be shoddily built and mechanically fragile. Vehicles were breaking down with barely any miles on them, and the list of design faults that needed fixing kept getting longer. Turret traverse mechanisms jammed, welds cracked, and one report after another landed on desks in Moscow. People started asking whether it made more sense to switch over to Object 701 instead. The main Armored Directorate endorsed the idea in April, though the Ministry of Transport Machinery initially resisted. On April 29, 1946, the sixth prototype of Object 701, now carrying the official designation IS-4, was formally accepted into Red Army service. IS-3 production stopped in July, and by September the Chelyabinsk plant was assembling IS-4s. The production plan was ambitious, 155 tanks by year's end, scaling up to 6 per shift by the following May. After 3 years of prototyping, testing, political infighting, and bureaucratic delays, the IS-4 had finally made it into serial production. The timing, however, was terrible. Soviet defense industry was hemorrhaging talent. The war was over, and experienced engineers and skilled machinists were leaving military factories for civilian work that paid better or simply felt less grinding. Chelyabinsk lost many of its best people, and it showed immediately in what came off the production line. The tanks were riddled with hidden defects, problems that only appeared when the vehicles were actually driven hard. Between May and November 1946, the plant managed to put together just 6 IS-4s, and military inspectors rejected every single one. Each inspection uncovered new flaws in both design and workmanship. By December, the accumulated list of required modifications ran to hundreds of items, and military officials had tacked on several hundred more. At that point, fixing the IS-4 essentially meant redesigning it from the ground up. 2 tanks from a late 1946 batch were sent to the proving grounds in April 1947 for trials that lasted through June. The outcome was bad. Test crews logged a string of failures: running gear breakdowns, transmission problems, electrical faults. The evaluators also reported that the engine didn't have enough power for a nearly 60-ton vehicle. The cooling fans produced an excessive amount of noise, and when the crew buttoned up, closed all hatches, visibility from inside the fighting compartment dropped to almost nothing. Separate ballistic trials, conducted from March through May, told a very different story. In that one area, the IS-4 was genuinely exceptional. Its frontal armor stopped German 128mm armor-piercing rounds, traveling at 800 meters per second. The most powerful anti-tank ammunition Germany ever manufactured. No other Soviet tank of the period could survive that kind of punishment. Over the summer of 1947, the design team made so many changes that the tank coming out of the factory bore only a surface resemblance to the version adopted the year before. None of it solved the fundamental reliability issues, though. The constant back and forth between testing and redesign meant barely any tanks actually reached the troops that year. Of 200 planned, the Army took delivery of just 52, 46 freshly built and 6 reworked leftovers from the troubled 1946 batch. In January 1948, the Army halted IS-4 deliveries entirely after discovering transmission defects serious enough to endanger crews. The factory promised a quick fix, and shipments resumed about a month later. Incremental improvements continued trickling in. A TPU-47 intercom in March, revised road wheel adjustments in May, an automatic fuel drain system in August. That spring and summer, the main Armored Directorate ran a thorough field evaluation of 7 production IS-4s. The results were dismal. All 7 machines suffered breakdowns: engines, gearboxes, transmissions. On top of the mechanical failures, the commission flagged poor radio reception, hull seals that let dust pour into the crew compartment, and ventilation so inadequate that the crew's effectiveness dropped noticeably during extended firing. In August, the Army stopped accepting deliveries again. After tense negotiations, a deal was struck. The military would test up to half the tanks in each batch before signing off on them. During one of these acceptance checks in December, 18 out of 24 IS-4s failed due to engine or transmission trouble. 3/4 of the batch couldn't finish a routine test drive. Total production by that point was somewhere around 224 vehicles, though some sources put the number at 233. The discrepancy has to do with how you count certain machines. The 6th prototype, for instance, was really a rebuilt 2nd prototype, and some tanks from the 1946 pilot run weren't formally accepted until 1947. Spot inspections at the Chelyabinsk factory found that many parts had been machined in clear violation of technical specifications. On January 1, 1949, deliveries were suspended for the 3rd time. The question of what to do with the IS-4 went all the way to the Council of Ministers. At a February 1949 session, the country's senior leadership debated the program's future and settled on a compromise. Chelyabinsk was told to finish a final run of 12 tanks by May and then devote all its resources to repairing the vehicles already delivered. No more new production. Everything would go toward making the existing fleet actually work. In September, 10 recently completed tanks went out for field trials. The results were discouraging once more. Only 5 made it through without a serious breakdown. The trial records list 1 engine failure, 2 broken transmissions, 6 road wheels that had to be swapped out, and a snapped torsion bar. None of these were exotic failures. They were basic mechanical components, giving out far too early. When the vehicles came back to the factory afterward, mechanics found levels of wear that made no sense, given how few kilometers the tanks had actually driven. Parts were degrading and failing well ahead of their rated lifespans. The metal itself seemed to be wearing out prematurely. Engineers kept trying different fixes. Drawing on a reserve of spare parts, the plant put together 25 additional tanks that incorporated every correction the military had requested. These were designated IS-4M, the M standing for modernized. Between 1950 and 1951, another 217 tanks from earlier production runs were also brought up to the same standard. The upgrades focused on strengthening key transmission parts, reworking the engine cooling, and improving the hull seals. All IS-4 production and modernization wrapped up in December 1951. Depending on how you count, roughly 250 tanks of this type were built in total, including the upgraded vehicles. The first IS-4s, back in 1947, had gone to training units, the Chelyabinsk Tank Technical School, and the 30th Training Tank Regiment, where they were used to develop tactics and train crews. The first actual combat formation to get them was the 5th Guards Mechanized Army, a unit with a distinguished wartime record. Getting even that one formation fully equipped took until the end of January 1949, thanks to the glacial production pace and constant breakdowns. The 5th Guards later participated in large-scale exercises, pitting the IS-4 against the newer T-54 medium tank. The exercises went poorly for the heavy machine. It was too heavy for most bridges in the exercise area, struggled on rough ground, and kept breaking down. Officers noted a long list of mechanical problems and reported that the IS-4 didn't meet current requirements for a heavy tank. By that point, development was already underway on a replacement, a new heavy tank that would eventually become the T-10. The original plan called for the 5th Guards Mechanized Army to transition to T-10s first, with the IS-4s going to newly created heavy tank regiments. That plan stalled because there simply weren't enough working IS-4s to go around. About 80 were perpetually sitting at the factory waiting for repairs. Only 2 IS-4 equipped regiments were ever actually stood up. In 1954, both were reorganized into mixed regiments that also fielded IS-2s and IS-3s, partly because no single type existed in sufficient numbers to fill a regiment on its own, and partly in hopes that mixing the types would compensate for each model's individual shortcomings. The IS-4 lingered in active service for a few more years after that, but less and less was asked of it. The tanks spent most of their time parked in motor pools. Crews would take them out for a gunnery exercise now and then, and that was about it. For a tank that was supposed to lead armored breakthroughs, it was a fairly humiliating Twilight. By 1960, every surviving IS-4 had been overhauled one last time, pulled from active units, and sent to long-term storage. That looked like the end. Hundreds of tanks that had cost a fortune to develop and build were sitting on depot lots, rusting, with zero prospect of seeing action. Then the geopolitical situation intervened. Through the late 1960s, the relationship between the Soviet Union and China was falling apart. Two countries that had called each other allies and ideological brothers just a few years earlier were now staring at each other across a tense border. Ideological arguments had hardened into territorial claims. Diplomatic cables gave way to troop movements. The Chinese military established a 200-kilometer exclusion zone on their side of the frontier and started positioning forces along it. Moscow's response was to reinforce the border with everything available. Fortifying thousands of kilometers of frontier required an enormous number of defensive positions, and pouring reinforced concrete bunkers along the entire line would have taken too long and cost too much. Military engineers found a cheaper alternative: take the old tanks out of storage and use them as ready-made pillboxes. The armor and guns on these obsolete vehicles were still perfectly capable in a static defensive role, and repurposing them cost a fraction of what purpose-built fortifications would have. That is how the IS-4 got pulled out of mothballs, not for the mobile armored warfare it was designed for, but to sit in a hole in the ground and wait. Tanks that had been built to spearhead breakthroughs were instead driven to pre-selected positions and half buried. The crews would drive them into excavated pits so that only the turret and its 122mm gun stuck out above ground level. The thick cast turret armor gave the men inside decent protection against return fire, and the gun could engage enemy vehicles at long range. In some cases, the arrangement was more elaborate. The turret was lifted off the hull entirely and installed in a purpose-built concrete emplacement with an underground bunker beneath it. These complexes were essentially self-sufficient defensive posts. Underground, there was living space for the garrison, along with ammunition storage and food supplies, enough to hold out for a prolonged period. The turret, sitting in its concrete housing, functioned as a fixed gun position with a substantial ammunition reserve and round-the-clock readiness. Plenty of the positions were much cruder, though. A tank would simply be driven into a pit, packed with dirt up to the turret ring, and camouflaged with local vegetation and netting. A small crew could sit inside for days or weeks at a stretch, watching their sector and ready to fire at anything that moved into range. The irony was that being unable to move actually solved the IS-4's worst problems. The unreliable transmission and temperamental engine didn't matter when the tank never had to go anywhere. As a fixed gun emplacement, the machine could finally do what its designers had always intended: deliver heavy firepower behind thick armor, just not in the way anyone had originally imagined. These positions dotted the entire length of the Soviet-Chinese border. The IS-4 wasn't the only obsolete type pressed into this role, but its exceptionally heavy turret armor made it the most valued piece in the defensive line. The turret's 250 millimeters of cast armor could shrug off most field artillery and tank guns of that era. Crews manning these positions could take fire and keep fighting without much risk of penetration. The big war with China, though, never materialized. There were real clashes, most notably the fighting around Damansky Island in March 1969, where soldiers on both sides were killed. But the broader conflict gradually cooled down rather than escalating. Diplomatic contact resumed, slowly and grudgingly, with neither side willing to be seen as backing down first. The fortified border zones stayed manned and on alert for years afterward, but the probability of them being needed kept dropping. By the 1980s, Soviet-Chinese relations had thawed enough that the whole defensive posture started to look like an anachronism. The tank positions were gradually stood down and taken off combat alert. Ammunition was removed, guns were cleared, and the crews were reassigned. The tanks themselves were simply left where they were, steel husks jutting out of the earth with no one left to maintain them. In 1997, Russia and China signed an agreement on mutual force reductions in the border regions, which formally ended whatever residual military role the IS-4 might still have had. A handful of these machines can still be found today in isolated spots across Russia's Far East and Kazakhstan. They sit half swallowed by the ground, rusted through, gradually becoming part of the terrain. The heaviest armored tank the Soviet Union ever produced spent its entire existence either breaking down in a factory yard or standing motionless in a hole, waiting for a fight that never came.